quickly on to the next panel, which is looking at questions of risk transfer and financing. Your program says that Dr. Hugh Khan from EQC is going to be speaking here, but in fact he's lost his voice today, so we have instead Bryan Dunne, who's General Manager of Strategy. We also have Hilary from the Treasury, Fiscal and State Sector Management. Bryce Davies from IAG, a very large insurance company, of course, been heavily involved and exposed in Canterbury, and Paul Johnston from the Wellington City Council. So, Bryan, on behalf of Hugh, please. Thank you.
Well, first of all, Hugh does send his apologies. For those of you who know Hugh, you're probably looking at me thinking, crikey, the last 4 years have really taken a toll on him. I'm looking forward to his presentation, as I know you are, so we'll quickly rush through it, if only because I'm not quite sure what is in the presentation. As I do it, I want you to keep close eye on Sir Martin. As you know, he's the chair of EQC. So any nods are EQC's view, any frowns are my personal view and shouldn't be taken any other way. Well, here's an interesting tidbit from Hugh. This, I believe, is, as you can see, non-life premium. So I think the point here is that New Zealand and Australia, so Australasia more broadly, is quite a small blip on the insurance market. It's about 2.5% of premium. So Martin and others have touched on before EQC's research role, and much of our research focus is on informing insurance and reinsurance markets about both the hazards and also the risks associated with that hazard, so that we can get a price differential and price New Zealand's risk on behalf of insurance markets. I think what we see here is what look like the losses for the Australasian market, so from 1980 to 2009, so prior to the Christchurch earthquakes. And you'll see that whilst we got about 2.5% of premium, we were about 2% of losses over that period of time. Post 2010, you'll see that massive and significant growth. Now, in any other context, and my former colleagues at Treasury would be delighted if we could go from 2% to 20% growth. But in this context, it's not such a positive. I think the other observation there as well is when we say Australasia, we should also, I think, as part of this conversation, be thinking about our Pacific neighbours and the ability to risk pool. This conversation we're having here today about New Zealand, I think, is equally applicable to small island nations, for which we also have a responsibility and an interest. I think this has been the focus of today's conversation, which is a broad, holistic conversation about risk. And in my view, the conversation that we're having now about risk transfer is really, really appropriate that we have it at this stage in the session. It's not the first part of the conversation, it's one of the last parts of the conversation. So it's great that it's part of today's conversation, but it shouldn't dominate. I think that it's also because it comes after conversations about risks and the hazards associated with them, and about our broad approach to that, about what risks can we avoid, what risks can we control, what risks can we transfer, and to Mayor Dalziel's point this morning, or this afternoon I should say, a little bit about what risks do we have to accept. And insurance has a limited role in that. I think we need to recognise it as well. I was also observe the conversation about build back better, I should say. Just a truism that insurance gives you what you had. So as part of the build back better, it's got a limited role. This slide, I think if Hugh was here, he'd be talking quite a lot about trying to strike the right space in here between decisions, who decides, who pays, and who's part of that conversation. I mentioned the ACTA model. I know that we're using the 4 R's at the moment, but in my language, the decisions about avoiding, controlling, transferring and accepting are all part of the conversation. As I say, the risk transfer element is one that EQC is probably well known for, but we do quite a lot in the control and avoid space in terms of our research agenda and our education agenda. Now, if Hugh is here, this probably will take us slightly longer, so I'm going to leave more time for questions.
Good afternoon. I'm part of a team in Treasury that provides a broad range of advice on the Canterbury earthquake recovery, and this includes accounting for the Crown contribution to the rebuild. I also lead the sustainability dimension of the Treasury's Living Standards framework. So Treasury advice on New Zealand's living standards is based on understanding and growing our natural, human, social and economic capitals. And we look at these capitals at the system level and through a number of lenses, which include managing risk, enabling resilience and sustainability. And today I'm just going to talk about these lenses as they relate to economic capital, but we've done work in Treasury that applies them to quite a wider range of issues. Oh, still managed to do it the wrong way in spite of asking.
I'll repeat it, it was good enough.
There we go. So this is a diagram that we use to talk about risk, resilience and sustainability. Going from left to right in this diagram, we're going from simple to complex systems and from the short term to the long term. Simple systems and known risk means that we can use fairly prescriptive approaches to risk management. An example for us might be something that we apply at the departmental or agency level. As systems become more complex and less predictable, we look instead to build resilience to adverse shocks. For Treasury, sustainability in economic terms means that the government can provide services on a sustained basis, and it's able to fund both its current and future liabilities, such as healthcare and retirement incomes. We know that there will be any number of shocks over the long term, even though we can't predict what and when, but the government must be able to respond financially to adverse events, including major disasters. The Public Finance Act, which Treasury enthusiastically administers, is the basis for this financial response. The Public Finance Act is the rule book for all central government spending, but there's much more to it than just some boring old accounting rules. The Act actually prescribes in legislation the risk management and resilience principles that the government must follow, and a key measure of this is the ratio of net debt to GDP. This measure of resilience is similar to the target in the Sendai framework that countries reduce direct disaster economic loss in relation to GDP by 2030. The direct cost to the Crown of the Canterbury earthquakes have been substantial. Even for Treasury, which deals in big numbers on a daily basis, these costs are eye-wateringly large. The headline number in the 2015 budget is $16.5 billion, and that's based on current policy settings and decisions that have been taken to date. And just by way of an example, the middle grey band in this slide shows how big a chunk of the government's capital spending will be taken up by the Christchurch rebuild over the next 4 years, compared to spending in other sectors. So you can see it's quite a big lump. Now, for New Zealand, the costs of the Canterbury earthquakes were compounded because they occurred when the economy was still affected by going into recession in 2008 and by the global financial crisis. The government has a number of financial tools available to meet costs, such as it can raise earthquake bonds, but notwithstanding any other measures, the government has supported the economy since 2008 by allowing greater operating deficits. Now, we were able to do this because the Crown's starting position in 2008 was a very low net debt to GDP ratio of 5.5%, and you can see it in this graph as the lowest point on the graph. We also had high levels of net worth, and they provided a substantially material economic buffer. So in other words, at that point we had a very good level of economic resilience, and that was thanks in a great part to successive governments' good financial management practices under the Public Finance Act. So this approach has cushioned New Zealand from the worst effects of these economic shocks, but it has reduced our future resilience. The debt to GDP ratio now sits at around 26%. Government policy is to get it back down to 20% by 2020 and to continue to reduce the ratio after that. Sticking to this track, the one that's on that graph, however, depends on any additional cost to the Crown being met within budget allowances and the use of surpluses to reduce debt. And I think the take-up for me from this slide is that it's going to take over a decade from now to return to the low debt position we were in before the GFC and the Canterbury earthquakes. And referring back to the Sendai target, it becomes very clear that reducing net debt to GDP ratios, it's a long-term fix, not a quick one.
Right, I feel a little left out because I only have one slide and that's it, so I'll just be talking. I'm from IG. For those, hopefully you know who we are. If you don't, you'll know our brands. That's State AMI, NZI and Lumley. Just to clarify, we don't sponsor the All Blacks. We often get confused. Look, the Sendai framework calls for more collaboration between the private sector, public sector, academia, and a whole bunch of other actors who have an important role in disaster risk reduction. And I think that's very important, and I support it wholeheartedly. I want to use this time to talk briefly about the role of an insurer, so I'm talking about us, IAG, not necessarily the industry, in disaster risk reduction. Now, obviously, it is about risk transfer and financing, and the importance of this conversation is that our systemic management of risk, natural hazard risk in New Zealand, is central to the confidence that reinsurers have in our country and their willingness to put capital at risk. So these are very important conversations for maintaining a healthy insurance market and protecting our homes and businesses because of that. There's lots I could talk about in terms of very specific kind of industry issues or things closely attached to it. Risk-based pricing, and you heard Tim talk about the impact that going down that route too far might have in Lower Hutt. We could talk about the role we play in advocating around land use planning through the Auckland Unitary Plan and RMA reform, the vexed issue of retreat and how we manage existing use rights, all very complex issues that are of interest and importance to us as an insurer. But I want to talk about some slightly different things. They are issues that are important to us as an insurer, and the kind of technical issues, but we also have a role as a business that I want to talk about as well, as part of the private sector. I just want to quickly acknowledge Bryan's point that we are at the end of the chain. There are a lot of very important decisions that need to be made about how we choose to deal with risk. And I think one of the most important things as a nation we need to figure out at a national level and at local levels is what is our risk appetite. So that's a fundamental driver of how we will make decisions about what risk we choose to take on and what risk we choose to transfer, for example. Tim this morning talked about the important role that an insurer has in the economy. It's an economic role, it promotes investment and trade, but there's also a social role that we play in terms of fostering a sense of well-being, and more importantly, actually helping people get back on their feet when disaster does strike. What might look like a seemingly simple transfer of risk relies on a whole bunch of competing drivers coming together. But fundamentally, it relies on the fact that we can make insurance available, make it relevant for people, make it reliable, so it does what it says on the tin, make it affordable, and unfortunately, we also have to make it profitable so that we can keep people's capital here. That requires some very careful balancing of the needs of a whole range of stakeholders. Of fundamental importance beyond all of that is the fact that we have high participation rates in insurance. And while that might sound a little self-serving, it's really important to remember the level of risk we have in New Zealand. And although we account for a very small amount of premium, we are a very well-insured country. And we need to maintain that if we want to be able to continue to transfer risk. The problem is that level of participation is declining, and we can expect it to decline further as we see economic and demographic trends play out. So I want to pick up on the idea of collaboration. The first example of collaboration is some work we're doing with the Treasury about just sharing our understanding of what's happening in the market. We have a perspective of non-insurance and underinsurance, and it's important that we share that information with the likes of central government so that they can make better informed decisions about how we maintain the health and the effectiveness of the insurance industry. Yes, we have a part to play in that, but I think there are other actors that also need to be involved. So we're quite open and free to share information in that regard so we can make some better decisions. The other idea of collaboration I want to talk about is a project we're going to launch within the next month, and It's really about the role of private sector. It's an example of that. We are partnering up with 4 other organisations and an NGO to do, in essence, a lessons learned project. Leanne, you were talking about that earlier in your speech. The idea here is pretty simple. New Zealand is exposed to hazards. The business community has a very central role in responding to those hazards and enabling recovery. First and foremost, businesses need to recover in and of themselves, and that has a whole lot of spill-on benefits, psychosocial, households, the like. But there's more that business can do, and the way it actually plays its role and other activity it undertakes. So what we are going to do, our little consortium, is use the experience of Canterbury earthquakes to understand what role has business played, what was good about it, what wasn't so good about it, and how do we find the lessons that we can take forward both in this recovery and in the next recovery, so that we can make an even better contribution, so that recovery for future communities, for future households, future businesses are faster and more assured. I'm well over time, but it gives you a sense of a little bit of what a private sector participant can do. Yes, there's stuff we can do that are specific to our industry, but there are other things that I think, if we can get the value out of the business community, can add a lot into this debate.
Hi, I'm Paul Johnston from Wellington City Council. My sort of presentation is more around insurance and the role that insurance plays to us as a council in terms of protecting our assets. Thank you. So the project that we've worked on in the last 6 or so months now in council is to develop an insurance management strategy. And what we want that to cover, and what it does actually cover, is the council's insurance and risk framework. Now that's existed within council for many, many years, so it's nothing new to us to have that level of certainty in terms of what we do and why we do it. The approach to risk retention, which includes the level of deductibles and risks that we're willing to take as a council on behalf of the community. And that includes, what level of day-to-day losses that we're happy to accept rather than transfer that risk to insurers. And then obviously there is the transfer of risk through the procurement of insurance policies. Now, some of the risks we choose not to carry due to the cost and the frequency of it. And also, there are other sort of risk policies that we can look to adopt or take account of. And those are sort of tools such as catastrophe bonds, which we don't currently use at council, but they are included within our strategy. And the reason that we've not included them at this stage is because of their relative expensive nature. And obviously it sets out the implementation and the monitoring requirements of our strategy. Now, the monitoring requirements is to ensure the strategy remains current and takes account of any changes, in terms of what's happening in terms of external and internal influences to that strategy, both in terms of our infrastructure strategy and our financial strategy, and obviously what's happening to our assets and the environment. We report this to our council in terms of our audit and risk committee and the council itself, so we do have a fairly robust reporting regime in place. Another reason that the why now in terms of an insurance management strategy is our environment is changing and continues to change. Christchurch earthquake and earthquakes before them continue to shape our risk and financial landscape that we all operate in. We have greater intensification, increases expectations on our assets in terms of our three waters, our road network, wall, sea defences, bridges, tunnels, increasing use of those particular assets and increasing use of expectations that they will always be there and always be available. Obviously, some of these assets will sustain damage in a major event. That is something that we do know and we've all experienced. The development of an insurance strategy was to formalise our existing process that we have at council. It covers how we manage our catastrophic risk, earthquake, tsunami, fire, flood, etc., etc., and the other day-to-day risks that can create future liabilities. Our strategy even touches on other insurance policies that we hold at council, even in terms of general liability, all the way down through to our travel insurance policy, so it is all-encompassing. Obviously, our major risk to this region is earthquake risk and earthquake risk mitigation. The focus of the strategy is, as you would expect, on recovery and having sufficient financial resources whether through our reserves, insurance and access to additional borrowings. We want to make sure that we are prepared for a particular major earthquake. It's also intended to try, where possible, to minimise the economic loss by having the funds in place to replace, rebuild the lost or damaged assets as a result of an event. To give some sort of context, WCC looks after $5.5 billion worth of assets, and that's in terms of replacement value. We do cover those assets and cover all those assets in terms of risk mitigation. The policy looks at a rough 1 in 1,000 year event, so we've got sufficient funds to cover a 1 in 1,000 year event and beyond. If you look across the private and public sector, I found very few instances of an insurance management strategy that was documented or articulated the sort of work that we're trying to do here at Council. But obviously my research wasn't as comprehensive as it may should have done, so I may ask the MC just to open the question to the floor to see how many insurance management strategies are out there, just to have an indication so that we're not the only ones in terms of the local sector. We also recognise that the level of information required to help formulate the strategy was key. For us to understand, or rather, for us to get an understanding of our assets and performance and how they respond to major events was critical. And it was the engagement of key professional consultancies to assist in our modelling of risk was key. So we used GNS and other agencies who we've partnered with for many, many years. So our landscape is well known. In terms of the other intended benefits of the strategy, we wanted to provide transparency to our elected members, and our Mayor here is present today, and to the community on how we protect our assets and the risks that we face in the environment that we live in. We wanted a framework that can be flexible enough to respond to the changing external and internal influences, and I'll come more on about that later on. And we wanted to provide clarity to other agencies and our insurers about the risk and our approach to risk. We wanted to provide a greater level of understanding that New Zealand is taking in regards to risk assessment and risk management, especially in terms of the Wellington region. We wanted a no surprises impact, and I'm nearly over time. So what I want to say is that these are again supported by our insurance strategies, infrastructure strategies, our financial strategies, and this is being adopted by Council at the end of this month. So our Council will be adopting this strategy for us to then monitor and continue ongoing with the strategy. A couple of gaps that I found, or issues that I found, is that we need a little bit more understanding of the central government consistency in terms of the funding that they provide, especially on the underground assets. But I understand there is now a process in place to deal with that in the next 12 months. We also recognise there are differing appetites between other councils in terms of level of cover, deductions. So the approach that we take here at WCC will be different to those that are in Auckland, Christchurch, Dunedin, etc. So we recognise we are different but the same. So we would like to see going forward improved reporting, greater level of transparency across the sector, and respond in a collaborative way to share our learnings as we go through this new process and this new environment that we're all in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. We have a few minutes for questions. Any questions? Any questions on this matter? Start right up here on the left. Right. Oh, okay, up there.
This transferring risk sounds good in theory, and it works fine when you dent your car. But when we have something like Christchurch happens, we have AMI go belly up and the government has to back them out. So we end up paying twice in our premiums and again in our taxes to the government to take over the risk. And then we have the situation of more than 4 years down the track, many people in Christchurch still haven't had their houses fixed or their claims settled, and the insurance industry now is doing cash settlements, and we're going to have the problem that people will have the cash, they're fed up with arguing, and they will move on, and the houses will sit there still unrepaired. So it works well in theory, but in Christchurch, coming from Christchurch, it doesn't work well in practice.
If I can respond on behalf of Council, in terms of what we do in terms of insurance, we buy insurance both locally and overseas. Our policy makes sure we go with A+ credited members in terms of an ability to pay. We're with Lloyd's in London, so we have a very, very good robust insurance profile in place. We spread our risk over approximately 35 to 40 insurers and reinsurers. So we've done the best we can in terms of making sure that our community assets are protected by well-respected and robust insurance agencies and reinsurers. I can't answer the question on the local market in terms of the housing stock, but in terms of what we do in council, we do go overseas as well as here to make sure we spread the risk. Anybody want to respond?
Yeah, I'm happy to respond to that as well. I think there's no doubt that for some people in the Christchurch community, the insurance process hasn't been the best for them. But I also think we're talking today about a recovery process, and I would argue that the recovery process in Christchurch has been faster than what you'd see overseas. Also, there's been a managed repair program, as you know, and as you commented on, that hasn't been tried before anywhere else in the world. If you compare Sendai, Japan, and the community in Sendai and the current conditions for them with Christchurch, there is a world of difference. In terms of the response of the reinsurance community, EQC was able to extend its reinsurance program with no exclusions in terms of peril, no exclusions in terms of geography, and that's akin to having your house on fire and going to your insurer and them saying, "I will chuck the garage and the car in as well." So I think the confidence that the market had in the recovery, I think was quite strong. I have no doubts, and my chief executive has been on television a number of times about our own performance on occasion, and I fully acknowledge that.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I don't think it's in any insurer's interest to leave a large community with a housing stock that is not safe and not in a good condition, because, well, if you just want to take a slightly self-interested point of view, that doesn't give us confidence to insure it. So we are very interested and very concerned about making sure we get people back into safe, sustainable homes. Has that process been smooth? No. Could it have been better? Yeah. But that's part of this process of learning, and to Brian's point, you know, this has been a pretty unique sort of process and a unique set of events and circumstances down there. Just to respond to your point around cash settlements, that is that's about actually giving people a bit of choice. It's not a compulsory thing. We kind of recognise it has been 4 years. People are wanting to move on, and if this is the means by which they can do that, then we need to make that available for them. If that's not right for them, if they do have concerns about their ability to make the most of that situation, or they are invulnerable in some way, then that situation will not be forced on them. It's about providing choice. And as I say, ultimately it's about making sure that we can have a community that's back and functioning and can be insured.
Thanks, Bryce. We've got time for one more question. Yeah.
The insurance for Chile was much bigger earthquake, was sorted out in less than a year, and I wonder, would it help if there wasn't this divide between insuring the house and doing content? Would it be better if EQC just did the house and people would do content? And also this divide between EQC as a government insurer and private insurers. Every case you've got this division between two insurers and house and content. Would that help?
Yeah, I think the Chilean response was that they cash settled everything. We just had somebody comment on the fact that maybe people don't want cash settlement. And two, there is a review of the Earthquake Commission Act that's underway. But I think I'd also, I think Bryce will probably comment on this as well, in terms of the 170,000 houses for which EQC has received a claim, just over 24,000 are being dealt with by the private market. So the vast majority of damage in Christchurch has been dealt with by EQC, and for which, it was 22 people, and it's now 1,600, or was 1,600 to 1,700. So, and its ability to both pool that loss and ensure, as Bryce commented on, very, very high uptakes of insurance across the community. The $40 billion economic loss that Hilary worries about at night, about 80% of that is being met by international capital markets through insurance.
I only worry about the 16.
Oh, so she only worries about the 16, sorry. So she doesn't look that tired from where I'm sitting.
Do you mind if I ask a question of the floor. Does anyone within their organisation have an existing insurance management strategy, both local or private sector? Any hands up will be right at the back.
One or
Cable
two.
car.
1.
2, 3.
Okay.
We'll run a conversation afterwards if you're free for a coffee.
Okay. Could I on your behalf, thank all the panellists for their contribution. I would just like to make two very brief points in finishing. One is the fact that we're having this discussion about risk transfer and insurance under the Sendai framework is in itself quite unusual, because when we went to Sendai, and I kid you not, the word insurance did not appear in the UN draft declaration and was not in the Kyoto Declaration, and it took a lot of effort on behalf of the Minister of the New Zealand delegation even to get the concept of insurance for national disasters onto the international agenda. And I have to say there was quite a lot of opposition from a lot of countries to that for reasons that I won't explain. And the second thing is really to underline Bryan's point, and the point that Bryce made, that we have very high levels of insurance in New Zealand. 80% of the losses in Canterbury have been covered with insurance, and of course it's difficult because it's a disaster. But sitting as we do around the board table at EQC, we've been enormously well supported by the reinsurance and the financial resources that are available in Canterbury. You cannot compare that with Nepal, Vanuatu, Haiti, where basically there's no insurance capital available at all, and their recovery paths, I assure you, will be much, much longer, much more stressful. So we have a real national strategic interest in making sure that the insurance markets remain viable and attractive, both to customers and to providers, because if we don't have that, anything that comes along next is going to be much, much worse, however difficult it is to actually implement. Thank you very much, and over to Jonathan.